The sound of keys jingling echoed through the silent house as Ryan Mitchell stepped through his front door. His weathered hands trembled slightly, not from the weight of his duffel bag, but from anticipation. 3 deployments, 4 combat zones, and 547 days since he'd felt Ranger's wet nose press against his palm. Home at last. "Ranger? Here, boy?" His voice cracked with emotion as he called out, expecting the thunderous gallop of paws against hard wood. Nothing. The silence hung heavy, unnatural. Ryan dropped his bag and moved deeper into the house, boots still on. "Jessica? Ranger?" Only hollow emptiness answered back. His eyes caught sight of the corner where Ranger's bed should have been. Empty. The custom cedar chest where they kept his toys, gone. Heart racing, he rushed to the kitchen where Ranger's bowls had always sat. Bare floor. When Jessica's car pulled into the driveway, Ryan was already sitting at the kitchen table, Ranger's collar clutched in his white-knuckled grip. The only thing left of his dog. "Where is he?" Ryan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Jessica's face crumpled. "Ryan. I had to sell him. I'm so sorry." The world stopped turning. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Ryan Mitchell hadn't always been a man of few words. Before the war changed him, he'd been known around Oak Ridge, Montana as a gregarious local boy with an easy smile. The youngest son of a ranching family, he'd enlisted at 23, seeking adventure and purpose beyond the rolling hills of his hometown. Now, at 35, his eyes carried the weight of experiences that most of his neighbors couldn't begin to comprehend. Ranger had come into Ryan's life during his second tour, a military working dog reassigned after his previous handler was killed in action. The German Shepherd, with his intelligent amber eyes and alert ears, had been standoffish at first, perhaps mourning his former partner in his own way. But over time, through training exercises and long nights on patrol, an unbreakable bond had formed between them. Oak Ridge hadn't changed much in Ryan's absence. The same faded American flags hung from porches along Main Street. Donovan's Hardware still had the same bell above the door, and Old Man Pedersen still held court each morning at the diner. It was a town where everyone knew everyone's business, where military service was revered, and where tradition held firm against the changing tides of the outside world. The incident in Afghanistan had cemented their partnership in blood and valor. Their unit had been ambushed during a routine patrol in Kandahar province. It was Ranger who had sensed the danger first, his body tensing seconds before the first shots rang out. When Ryan took shrapnel to his leg, it was Ranger who dragged him behind cover, saving his life. Both of them had been injured that day. Ryan with wounds that would take months to heal, Ranger with a gash across his flank that left a scar hidden beneath his fur. After their medical discharge, the military had allowed Ryan to adopt Ranger officially. The dog had become more than a pet. He was a battle brother, a confidant, and eventually a service animal who could sense Ryan's PTSD episodes before they overtook him. On the darkest nights, when memories of gunfire and explosions jolted Ryan awake, it was Ranger's steady presence that anchored him to reality. Jessica had never fully understood their connection. She had married Ryan before his first deployment, a high school sweetheart who had promised to wait. And she had waited through 3 deployments, through the nightmares, through the man who came back different each time. But the distance between them had grown, stretched thin by absence and the invisible wounds of war that Ryan brought home. The morning after his return, Ryan sat at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched, as he stared at Jessica across from him. The silence between them stretched thin, filled only by the ticking of the wall clock that had been a wedding gift from her parents. "I don't understand," Ryan finally said, his voice hollow. "How could you sell him? He wasn't just a dog, Jessica. He was—" His voice trailed off, unable to find words adequate enough to describe what Ranger meant to him. Jessica's eyes remained fixed on her hands, which were wrapped tightly around her own mug. The bills were piling up, Ryan. The roof needed repairs, the car broke down twice, and my hours at the hospital got cut. She looked up, her expression hardening. You were gone, and I was drowning here. We had savings, Ryan countered, feeling the heat rise in his chest. Nearly $30,000 in the account. That was gone, too, Jessica admitted quietly. My mama needed surgery. Insurance wouldn't cover it all. Ryan ran his hand across his face, the stubble from days of travel rough against his palm. He wanted to be understanding, wanted to see things from her perspective, but all he could think about was Ranger, confused, wondering why his family had abandoned him. You should have told me. Called me. Something. And what would you have done from 8,000 miles away? Jessica shot back, her voice rising. You were in an active combat zone. Was I supposed to add financial stress to everything else you were dealing with? Ryan stood up suddenly, sending his chair scraping across the linoleum. So instead you saw my dog without a word, the dog who saved my life, who got me through rehab, who keeps the nightmares at bay? Jessica's eyes welled with tears. I'm sorry. I thought maybe it would help you move on. From the military, from everything that happened over there. As long as you had Ranger, you were still there in your mind. The realization hit Ryan like a physical blow. This wasn't just about money. Jessica had sold Ranger because she wanted to erase the parts of him that had changed during war. She wanted the old Ryan back, the one who left Oak Ridge all those years ago. Who did you sell him to? Ryan asked, his voice dangerous in its quietness. A man named Foster, Michael Foster. He lives on the other side of town. Brian grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. I'm going to find him. Ryan, please, Jessica called after him. It's been 6 months. Ranger has a new home now. But Ryan was already out the door, the slam echoing through the house like a gunshot. His first stop was the Oak Ridge Animal Shelter, a modest building on the edge of town where he and Jessica had first considered adopting a dog before his military career took them in a different direction. The woman at the front desk, Amy, recognized him immediately. Ryan Mitchell, back from overseas, I see. How can I help you? I'm looking for information on a German Shepherd that might have come through here about 6 months ago. My wife sold him while I was deployed. Amy's smile faltered. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. We don't handle private sales, but Dr. Anderson might know something. She treats most of the dogs in town. Dr. Sarah Anderson had been the veterinarian in Oak Ridge for as long as Ryan could remember. Her clinic sat adjacent to the shelter, a small practice with a big heart for animals. Ryan found her examining a border collie when he entered. Ryan, she said, genuine surprise in her voice as she looked up. Welcome home. Give me just a minute to finish up here. When she was done, she led him to her office, her expression grave as if she already knew why he was there. I'm looking for Ranger, Ryan said without preamble. Jessica sold him while I was gone. Dr. Anderson sighed deeply. I was afraid of this. Yes, I know about Ranger. Jessica brought him in for a final checkup before the sale. She hesitated. Ryan, I tried to talk her out of it. I knew what that dog meant to you. Do you know who bought him? She mentioned someone named Foster. Michael Foster, Dr. Anderson confirmed. He's a veteran, too. Lost both legs in Iraq about 10 years ago. He was specifically looking for a trained service dog. Ryan felt a complicated mix of emotions. On one hand, at least Ranger had gone to another veteran, someone who might understand the bond between a handler and his dog. On the other hand, this Foster had taken something that wasn't Jessica's to give away. Where can I find him? Dr. Anderson seemed reluctant, but eventually wrote down an address on the far side of town. He lives in that new development past the creek. But Ryan," she placed a hand on his arm, "Foster legally purchased Ranger, and he needs him, too." "Not like I do," Ryan said, his voice breaking slightly. "Nobody needs him like I do." As he left the clinic, word was already spreading through town. Oak Ridge was small that way. News traveled fast, especially when it involved one of their soldiers. By the time Ryan stopped at the diner for lunch, he could feel the eyes on him, hear the whispers. "That's Mitchell's boy," he overheard someone say. "His wife sold his service dog while he was overseas. Can you imagine?" Some offered sympathetic nods. Others looked away uncomfortably. Ryan realized that some people had watched Jessica sell Ranger, and said nothing. As he sat at the counter, picking at a sandwich he had no appetite for, Officer Thomas Burke slid on to the stool beside him. They had played high school football together before Thomas joined the police force and Ryan enlisted. "Heard you were looking for your dog," Burke said, signaling for coffee. "News travels fast." "Small town," Burke shrugged. "Listen, I know Foster. He's a good guy. What happened isn't his fault." "I'm not blaming him," Ryan said, though part of him did. "I just want my dog back." Burke looked at him steadily. "Just don't do anything stupid, Ryan. Foster's got rights, too, legally speaking." Ryan nodded, but his resolve was unshaken. He didn't care about legality or property rights. Ranger wasn't just property. He was family, and Ryan Mitchell was going to bring his family home. The Foster residence sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, a single-story ranch home with a newly built wheelchair ramp leading to the front door. Ryan sat in his truck across the street, gathering his courage. He'd faced insurgents and IEDs with less trepidation than he felt now, knocking on a fellow veteran's door to demand his dog back. A woman walking her corgi passed by, giving Ryan a curious glance. He realized how suspicious he must look, a strange man sitting in a parked truck staring at a house. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the vehicle and approached the front door. His knock was answered almost immediately, as if someone had been watching his approach. The door swung open to reveal a man in his early 40s sitting in a wheelchair. His build suggested military training despite the missing legs, and his eyes held the same watchful wariness that Ryan recognized from his own reflection. "Can I help you?" the man asked, one hand resting protectively on the wheelchair arm. "Are you Michael Foster?" Ryan asked, though he already knew the answer. "I am. And you are?" "Ryan Mitchell. I'm here about—" Before Ryan could finish his sentence, a familiar bark sounded from inside the house, followed by the scrabbling of paws on hard wood. And then there he was, Ranger, his German shepherd, pushing his way past Foster's wheelchair to the door. Time seemed to stop. Ranger froze for just a moment, his ears perked forward, head tilted as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Then, with a high-pitched whine that tore at Ryan's heart, the dog launched himself forward. "Ranger!" Ryan dropped to his knees as the dog bowled into him, nearly knocking him over. Ranger's whole body wiggled with excitement, his tail whipping back and forth so hard it looked painful. He licked frantically at Ryan's face, whining and snuffling as if trying to convince himself this wasn't a dream. Ryan buried his face in the dog's fur, inhaling the familiar scent. Tears burned behind his closed eyelids as he wrapped his arms around his long-lost companion. For a moment nothing else existed, not Foster watching from the doorway, not the curious neighbors peeking through their blinds, not even Jessica's betrayal. Just Ryan and Ranger, reunited at last. "Right. So, you're the original owner," Foster said, his voice cutting through the emotional reunion. It wasn't a question. Ryan looked up, still clutching Ranger, who had positioned himself firmly against Ryan's leg as if afraid they'd be separated again. "Yes," he managed. "I was deployed. My wife sold him without my knowledge." Foster's expression softened slightly with understanding, but he wheeled himself forward, creating a boundary between Ryan and the house. "I'm sorry to hear that. That's a tough break." "I want him back," Ryan said simply. A shadow passed over Foster's face. "I understand you're upset, but I purchased him legally. I have the paperwork and everything. He's mine now." Ryan felt Ranger press closer against him, and his resolve hardened. "You don't understand. Ranger and I served together. He saved my life in Afghanistan. He's not just a pet." "He's not just a pet to me either," Foster countered, his voice taking on an edge. "I'm a double amputee. Ranger helps me function independently. He retrieves things I can't reach, helps me keep my balance when I'm transferring to and from my chair. He even pulls my wheelchair up the ramp when my arms are too tired." Ryan looked down at Ranger, noticing for the first time the specialized harness hanging on a hook by the door. Equipment for service work different from the tactical vest he had worn overseas. "I need him," Foster continued, "and I've had him for 6 months now. We've bonded. He's adjusted to his new life." But looking at Ranger, Ryan wasn't so sure. The dog hadn't moved from his side and kept looking up at him with soulful eyes that seemed to beg Ryan not to leave again. "I need him too," Ryan said quietly. "He helps with my PTSD. Wakes me from nightmares. Keeps me grounded when the memories get too intense." Foster's jaw tightened. "Look, I sympathize. Really, I do. But the fact remains I bought him fair and square. Your issue is with your wife, not with me." A flash of anger shot through Ryan. He wasn't hers to sell. According to the law, he was. Pets are considered property in Montana. If your name wasn't specifically on his registration papers and the dog lived in a home she maintained, she had every right to sell him. Ryan realized Foster had done his homework. Perhaps he had even anticipated this confrontation someday. "I'm not leaving without my dog," Ryan said, his hand resting protectively on Ranger's head. Foster's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me? Because I should warn you, I've got neighbors watching right now, and if you try to take him, it's theft, plain and simple. You'll be arrested." Ryan glanced around and noticed several faces quickly ducking back behind curtains. News of his arrival had spread quickly. This confrontation was becoming the talk of Oak Ridge. "I'm not threatening anyone," Ryan said, forcing himself to remain calm. "But this isn't right. Ranger belongs with me." "The law says otherwise," Foster replied. "Now I'm going to have to ask you to leave my property." He wheeled back slightly and patted his leg. "Ranger, come." The German shepherd looked torn, whining as he glanced between the two men. Ryan felt the dog trembling against his leg. "Ranger," Foster said again, more firmly. With visible reluctance, Ranger pulled away from Ryan and returned to Foster's side, though his eyes remained fixed on Ryan, his tail low. The sight of his dog obeying another man's command felt like a knife twisting in Ryan's gut. But what could he do? Grab Ranger and run? That would only lead to criminal charges, and what kind of life would that give either of them? "This isn't over," Ryan said quietly. "I think it is," Foster responded. "I'm sorry about your situation, Mitchell, truly. But Ranger is mine now, and he's staying with me." As Foster retreated into the house with Ranger, the dog looked back over his shoulder one last time. The longing in those amber eyes nearly broke Ryan. The door closed with a definitive click, leaving Ryan alone on the porch. Word had already spread through Oak Ridge by dinner time. At the Copperpenny Diner, Ryan overheard snippets of conversation. "Poor Mitchell. Fighting for our country, while his wife sells his dog. But Foster needs the dog, too. Man can barely get around without help. Whose side are you on? Mitchell's a hero. This is Foster. Lost both legs in Iraq. The town was dividing, taking sides in a battle neither veteran had asked for. And somewhere in the middle was Ranger, A dog who had already given so much in service to his country, now torn between two broken warriors who both needed him desperately. The following days passed in a blur for Ryan. He spent most of his time in the spare bedroom of his and Jessica's house, unable to face the master bedroom they had once shared. The betrayal cut too deep, and every corner of the home reminded him of what he had lost, both his dog and his marriage. Jessica tried to talk to him a few times, standing hesitantly in the doorway with explanations and apologies that fell flat. Eventually, she started staying at her sister's place across town, leaving Ryan alone with his thoughts and the crushing silence that Ranger had once filled. On the third morning after his confrontation with Foster, Ryan opened his laptop and did something he'd been avoiding. He created a social media post about Ranger. He uploaded pictures of them together in Afghanistan. Ranger in his tactical vest sitting alertly next to Ryan, the two of them sharing a rare moment of relaxation on base. Ranger with an American flag bandana tied around his neck on the 4th of July. "This is Ranger," he wrote. "My battle buddy, my best friend, and my service dog. While I was deployed serving our country, my wife sold him without my knowledge or consent. I've located him here in Oak Ridge, but the new owner refuses to return him. I'm asking for your help and support in bringing my battle brother home where he belongs." Ryan hesitated before hitting post, wondering if he was crossing a line, but the memory of Ranger's eyes looking back at him as Foster closed the door strengthened his resolve. He clicked the button and closed the laptop. By noon, his phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. Local veterans were offering support. Neighbors he barely knew were expressing outrage on his behalf. A few comments defended Foster's legal right to keep the dog he had purchased, but they were quickly drowned out by the wave of sympathy for Ryan. "Mitchell." The voice on the phone belonged to Commander James Wilson, Ryan's former commanding officer. "Just saw your post. Damn shame what happened with your dog." "Sir," Ryan said, surprised to hear from Wilson. They had kept in sporadic contact after Ryan's medical discharge, but it had been months since they'd spoken. "I'm driving up to Oak Ridge tomorrow," Wilson continued. "Got some paperwork that might help your case. Ranger wasn't just any military dog. He received a commendation for that ambush in Kandahar. That might count for something." Hope flickered in Ryan's chest for the first time in days. "I'd appreciate that, sir." "Hang tight, son. We take care of our own." The call ended, and Ryan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this fight. That afternoon, as Ryan was leaving the house to pick up groceries, he noticed a woman taking photos of his home from the sidewalk. When she saw him, she approached eagerly, hand extended. "Mitchell, I'm Diane Lawson from the Oak Ridge Gazette. I'd love to get your side of the story about your service dog." Ryan recoiled slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. "I don't have a comment right now," he said, trying to move past her to his truck. "People are very interested in what's happening," she persisted. "There's talk about organizing a protest at Foster's house." This stopped Ryan cold. "A protest? No, that's not what I want." "But your pose." "I just wanted support, not a mob," Ryan said firmly. "Foster is a veteran, too. He deserves respect." As Ryan drove to the store, he noticed more stares than usual. Oak Ridge had always been a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but this felt different, more invasive, more judgmental. He wondered if he had made a mistake by making the situation public. At Wilson's Family Market, Ryan was selecting apples when an elderly man approached him, leaning heavily on a cane. "You, Mitchell?" the man asked gruffly. Ryan nodded cautiously. "I'm Vernon Tucker, Korea 52. The man extended a gnarled hand, which Ryan shook respectfully. "Read about your dog. Damn shame." "Thank you, sir," Ryan said. "But you're going about it all wrong," Tucker continued, his voice lowering. "That Foster fellow, he bought your dog fair and square. Man lost both his legs serving this country. You really want to take away his service animal?" Ryan felt his face blush. Ranger was my service animal first. He saved my life overseas." Tucker shook his head. "Life ain't fair, son. We all learned that the hard way over there. Sometimes you gotta accept what you can't change and move on." As Tucker shuffled away, Ryan stood frozen in the produce section, the old veteran's words echoing in his mind. Was he being selfish? Foster legitimately needed help, that was undeniable. But so did Ryan. The nightmares had returned with a vengeance since he'd been home without Ranger's comforting presence. Ryan's phone buzzed with a text from Officer Burke. "Heads up, people are planning to gather at Foster's place tonight. Nothing official, just concerned citizens, but it could get out of hand. You might want to make a statement asking them to stand down." Alarmed, Ryan abandoned his shopping cart and headed straight for his truck. This was spinning out of control faster than he had anticipated. The last thing he wanted was for Foster to feel threatened or harassed. Whatever their disagreement, they were both veterans. There had to be a better way to resolve this. As he drove toward Foster's neighborhood, Ryan noticed a small group already forming at the corner, some holding hastily made signs. "Bring Ranger home," one read, while another declared, "Support our troops, all of them," with pictures of both Ryan and Foster. Ryan parked his truck and approached the group, recognizing several faces from around town. "Mr. Mitchell," a young woman stepped forward, her expression earnest, "we're here to support you. We think it's terrible what happened to your dog." Ryan held up his hands, addressing the small crowd. "I appreciate the concern, everyone, but this isn't the way to handle it. Michael Foster is a veteran who served this country honorably. He bought Ranger legally, and he doesn't deserve to be intimidated in his own home." Murmurs rippled through the gathering, some nodding in agreement, others looking disappointed. "But your wife had no right to sell your dog," someone called out. "That's between me and my wife," Ryan replied firmly. "Please, go home. This isn't helping anyone, least of all Ranger." Reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse. As Ryan turned to leave, he noticed Foster watching from his window. Their eyes met briefly before Foster let the curtain fall back into place. The next morning, Commander Wilson arrived as promised, his SUV pulling into Ryan's driveway just after 9 a.m. Despite being in his mid-50s, Wilson maintained the ramrod posture and commanding presence that had earned him respect throughout his military career. "Mitchell," he said, embracing Ryan briefly before handing him a folder, "here's everything we have on Ranger's service record. Commendations, training certificates, medical records. Most importantly, documentation that he was officially released to you as your service animal after your injury." Ryan flipped through the papers, noting official letterhead and signatures. "Will this help legally?" Wilson's expression was measured. "It might. Military service dogs have a unique status. There's precedent for them being reunited with their handlers, especially when the separation wasn't voluntary." He paused. "But I've been making some calls. Foster doesn't just need any service dog. He specifically needs one with Ranger's training." "What do you mean?" "Ranger was trained to detect certain medical conditions. I'm not sure if you were aware, but some dogs can sense oncoming seizures or diabetic episodes. Foster has a condition that Ranger can detect. That's why he specifically sought out a dog with military training." Ryan felt the weight of this revelation. It wasn't just about mobility assistance. Ranger might be keeping Foster alive. Later that afternoon, Ryan received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Anderson pulled up in her clinic van, a concerned expression on her face. "Ryan, I need to talk to you about Ranger," she said as he invited her in. "I've been his vet since he came to town with you, and I've continued treating him at Foster's place." "How is he?" Ryan asked, hungry for information about his dog. Dr. Anderson hesitated. "Physically, he's fine, but there's something you should know. Foster hired a dog sitter named Carl to walk Ranger when he's at his physical therapy sessions. I've observed some concerning behavior. Carl is rough with Ranger, uses a choke collar, and I've seen him yank the leash hard enough to lift Ranger's front paws off the ground." Ryan's blood ran cold. "Does Foster know?" "I don't think so. Carl is careful around Foster, and Foster can't go on the walks himself. I tried to bring it up once, but Carl denied everything, and Foster seemed to trust him. This changed things. It wasn't just about who needed Ranger more. It was about Ranger's well-being, too." "Thank you for telling me," Ryan said, his jaw set with determination. That evening, Ryan drove to the address Dr. Anderson had given him, parking where he could observe the small park nearby. Sure enough, at 6:30, a stocky man with a shaved head appeared with Ranger on a leash. Ryan recognized him as Carl Mendez, a former bouncer at the local bar, who had been fired for being too aggressive with patrons. Ryan watched in growing anger as Carl jerked Ranger's leash repeatedly, cursing when the dog stopped to sniff something. When Ranger didn't immediately obey a command, Carl yanked so hard that Ranger yelped, a sound that sent a surge of protective rage through Ryan. Without thinking, Ryan got out of his truck and approached them. "Hey," he called out, "ease up on the dog." Carl turned, his expression hostile. "Mind your own business, buddy." "That dog is my business," Ryan said, closing the distance between them. "I'm Ryan Mitchell. That's my dog you're mistreating." Recognition dawned on Carl's face, followed by a sneer. "Not anymore, he ain't. Foster pays me good money to handle this mutt." "Does Foster know you're abusing him?" "I ain't abusing nobody," Carl protested. "Just teaching him discipline. Dogs need a firm hand." Ryan could see marks on Ranger's neck where the choke collar had dug in. "That's not discipline. That's cruelty. And I'm not going to let it continue." Carl puffed up his chest, stepping closer to Ryan. "Yeah? What are you going to do about it, soldier boy?" Ryan was keenly aware that they were in a public park, that people were watching, and that any physical confrontation would only make things worse. He pulled out his phone. "I'm going to document everything I see," Ryan said calmly. "Every time you mistreat this dog, it'll be recorded. And then I'm going to make sure Foster sees it all." Carl's face flushed with anger. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Ryan challenged. "Or you can hand over Ranger's leash right now, and I'll tell Foster you got called away for an emergency." For a moment it seemed like Carl might lunge at him, but then the man thrust the leash into Ryan's hand. "Fine. Take the stupid dog for his walk. But this ain't over, Mitchell." As Carl stalked away, Ranger pressed against Ryan's leg, his whole body quivering with excitement at being reunited with his former handler. Ryan knelt down, examining the marks on the dog's neck and reassuring him with gentle words. "It's okay, boy," Ryan murmured. "I've got you." But he knew this was temporary. He would have to return Ranger to Foster's house after the walk, and that was going to be one of the hardest things he'd ever done. As Ryan walked Ranger through the park, giving him the freedom to sniff and explore that Carl had denied him, he thought about his next steps. He needed to tell Foster about Carl's behavior, but he also needed to be smart about how he approached it. Foster might see it as just another attempt to get Ranger back. Lost in thought, Ryan didn't notice Jessica until she was almost in front of him. She looked tired, her normally carefully styled hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "In," she said, her voice soft with surprise. "And Ranger." She reached out toward the dog, but Ranger moved behind Ryan's legs, avoiding her touch. "He remembers who sold him," Ryan said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. Jessica withdrew her hand, hurt flashing across her face. "It's not fair. I did what I thought was best at the time." "But best for who, Jessica? Because it certainly wasn't best for me, or for Ranger." "I was drowning, Ryan," she said, her voice catching. "You were gone, and I was trying to hold everything together on my own. The bills, the house, everything. And when you were here, you were so consumed with your PTSD and with Ranger that there wasn't room for me anymore. Ryan's grip tightened on Ranger's leash. So you punished me by taking away the one thing that was helping me cope? I didn't see it that way, Jessica admitted. I thought if Ranger wasn't there as a constant reminder of what you went through, maybe you could move on. Maybe we could find our way back to each other. The irony struck Ryan like a physical blow. In trying to save their marriage, Jessica had ensured its end. I've moved out, Jessica continued when Ryan didn't respond. I'm staying with my sister for now, but I'm looking for an apartment. You can have the house. The house doesn't feel like home anymore, Ryan said quietly. Not without him. He looked down at Ranger, who was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes. Jessica nodded, understanding in her gaze. I really am sorry, Ryan. For what it's worth, I hope you get him back. As she walked away, Ryan felt a chapter of his life closing. His marriage had been over long before he came home to find Ranger gone, he realized. Perhaps it had ended the day he returned from his first deployment, changed in ways Jessica could never understand. Now he faced a difficult choice. Pursue his claim to Ranger through legal means, potentially harming a fellow veteran who genuinely needed the dog's assistance, or find another way forward, another path to healing that didn't depend on reclaiming what he had lost. As the sun began to set over Oak Ridge, casting long shadows across the park, Ryan made his decision. He would return Ranger to Foster tonight, but he would also tell him about Carl. And then he would propose something that might allow them both to have what they needed, a shared arrangement that recognized their unique bonds with Ranger and their shared experiences as veterans. It was a long shot, and Foster might refuse outright, but Ryan had to try, for Ranger's sake and for his own. The Oak Ridge Community Center hadn't seen this many people gathered in one place since the 4th of July picnic. Nearly every folding chair was filled, with latecomers standing along the back wall. The town's impromptu meeting about the Ranger situation had drawn more attendance than the annual budget hearing. Mayor Thompson, a portly man with a perpetually worried expression, stood at the podium looking distinctly uncomfortable with his role as mediator in what had become the most divisive issue to hit Oak Ridge in years. Ryan sat in the front row, Commander Wilson beside him providing silent support. Across the aisle, Michael Foster had positioned his wheelchair, flanked by two fellow veterans from his support group. Ranger was notably absent. Foster had wisely left him at home to avoid further complicating an already tense situation. "Folks, let's bring this meeting to order," Mayor Thompson began, tapping the microphone. "We're here to discuss the situation regarding the German Shepherd known as Ranger, and to hopefully find some community consensus on how to proceed." A murmur ran through the crowd. Consensus seemed unlikely given the heated debates that had been raging in diners and Facebook groups for days now. "I think we should hear from both parties directly involved," the mayor continued. "Mr. Mitchell, would you like to speak first?" Ryan stood, suddenly aware of all eyes upon him. Public speaking had never been his strength, but Ranger was worth facing this discomfort. He cleared his throat, turning slightly to address both the mayor and the assembled townspeople. "Most of you know me. I grew up here in Oak Ridge. When I joined the Army Special Forces, I was assigned to work with Ranger as my military working dog. We served 2 tours together. During an ambush in Afghanistan, Ranger saved not just my life, but the lives of 5 other soldiers in our unit. When I was injured, Ranger stayed by my side. He dragged me to safety while taking shrapnel himself." Ryan could see people in the audience nodding, some with tears in their eyes. "After we were both medically discharged, Ranger became my service dog. He's trained to wake me during night terrors. He can sense when I'm about to have a panic attack and helps ground me. When I was deployed again, I left him with my wife, believing he'd be here when I returned." Ryan paused, the pain of betrayal still fresh. "Instead, I came home to discover she had sold him without my knowledge or consent." A few disapproving murmurs rose from the crowd, and Mayor Thompson had to gesture for quiet. "I understand that Mr. Foster purchased Ranger legally," Ryan acknowledged. "I don't blame him for that. But Ranger is more than property to me. He's my battle buddy, my brother in arms. Anyone who's served knows what that bond means." He looked directly at Foster as he said this, man to man. "I'm asking for him to be returned to me, where he belongs." As Ryan sat down, applause broke out from many in the audience, particularly from the veterans gathered near the back. Mayor Thompson waited for the noise to subside before turning to Foster. "Mr. Foster, would you like to respond?" Foster wheeled himself forward, his movements precise and practiced. Unlike Ryan, he seemed comfortable addressing the crowd, his voice clear and confident. "Thank you, Mayor Thompson. First, I want to acknowledge Ryan Mitchell's service and sacrifice. What happened to him, coming home to find his dog sold, was wrong. If I had known the circumstances, I might have made different choices." Ryan felt a flicker of hope at these words. "However," Foster continued, "I purchased Ranger legally, with proper documentation. I've had him for 6 months now, and in that time he's become essential to my daily life. As you can all see," he gestured to his missing legs, "I have certain challenges. Ranger helps me navigate those challenges. He retrieves items I can't reach, helps me balance when I'm transferring to and from my wheelchair, and can even bring me my phone in an emergency." Foster paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. Then he took a deep breath. "What many of you don't know is that I have a medical condition called epilepsy, resulting from a traumatic brain injury during my service. Ranger isn't just mobility assistance for me. He's trained to detect my seizures before they happen. He gives me a warning so I can get to a safe position. He's saved me from serious injury multiple times in just these few months." A hush fell over the room as this new information sank in. Ryan felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. This was what Commander Wilson had hinted at, but hearing it directly from Foster made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I sympathize with Mr. Mitchell's position," Foster concluded, "but Ranger is performing a life-saving function for me now. I cannot and will not give him up." The lines had been drawn clearly now, and the impossible choice lay before the community: support the returning hero who had been betrayed, or stand with the disabled veteran whose life depended on the dog in question. Mayor Thompson looked even more uncomfortable than before. "Well, this is certainly a complex situation. Perhaps we should open the floor to comments from—" Before he could finish, the rear doors of the community center burst open. Heads turned as Jessica Mitchell entered, looking nervous but determined. Ryan stiffened in his seat, surprised to see his estranged wife stepping voluntarily into this public forum. "I'd like to speak, if I may," Jessica said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. Mayor Thompson nodded, gesturing her forward. Jessica walked slowly to the front, avoiding Ryan's gaze as she passed him. "My name is Jessica Mitchell," she began, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the podium. "I'm the one who sold Ranger while my husband was deployed. Before you all judge me, though I know many of you already have, I want to explain why." Ryan watched her intently, curious despite his anger. She had never fully explained her reasoning to him. "Ryan and I had been growing apart for years," Jessica continued. "Each time he came back from deployment, he was more distant, more connected to Ranger than to me. I told myself it was just the PTSD, that things would get better with time." She took a shaky breath. "When Ryan was called up for another deployment, I hit a breaking point. I was alone again, struggling to pay bills, watching our savings dwindle. My mother needed surgery that insurance wouldn't fully cover. I felt abandoned. Jessica looked directly at Ryan for the first time. I convinced myself that selling Ranger was the practical choice. We needed the money, and I believed— her voice broke slightly— I believed that as long as Ryan had Ranger, he would never truly come back to me. The dog was his emotional connection to the war, to the trauma. I thought without Ranger, Ryan might finally leave that part of his life behind. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Turning back to the crowd, Jessica straightened her shoulders. I made a terrible mistake. I hurt my husband deeply, and I can't undo that. But please don't punish Mr. Foster for my actions. He bought Ranger in good faith, not knowing the circumstances. With that, Jessica stepped away from the podium and walked quickly down the aisle and out of the building, leaving a contemplative silence in her wake. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat awkwardly. Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell, for that candid statement. Now, perhaps we should— His words were cut off by a sudden commotion from Foster's side of the room. Foster's body had gone rigid, his eyes unfocused, one hand clutching at his chest. "He's having a seizure," one of Foster's friends called out, moving to help him. But before anyone could reach him, Foster slumped forward in his wheelchair, unconscious. His body began to jerk rhythmically, a thin line of foam appearing at the corner of his mouth. Ryan was on his feet instantly, military training kicking in. He rushed to Foster's side, carefully easing him from the wheelchair to the floor with the help of another veteran. "Give him space," Ryan commanded, removing his own jacket to place under Foster's head. "Someone time this, and call an ambulance." The room erupted into panic murmurs as Ryan efficiently rolled Foster onto his side in the recovery position, protecting his airway. Commander Wilson was already on his phone calling 911, his voice calm and authoritative as he relayed the situation. "This is why he needs Ranger," someone in the crowd said loudly. "The dog would have warned him this was coming." Ryan knew they were right. Without Ranger's alert, Foster had been caught completely off guard in a public place, dangerous for someone with his physical limitations. The seizure itself lasted only about 2 minutes, but Foster remained disoriented and confused as he slowly regained consciousness. The paramedics arrived quickly, moving through the parted crowd with a stretcher. As they began assessing Foster, Ryan stepped back, his mind racing. Seeing Foster's vulnerability firsthand had shifted something within him. This wasn't just about who had the stronger claim to Ranger anymore. It was about who needed him most urgently. "Ryan," Commander Wilson said quietly, standing at his elbow, "you did good work there, quick thinking." Ryan nodded absently, watching as the paramedics prepared to transport Foster to the hospital. "I need to check on Ranger," he said suddenly. "Foster lives alone, with him in the hospital." Wilson understood immediately. "I'll drive you. You have Foster's address?" 20 minutes later, they pulled up outside Foster's house. Using the spare key that one of Foster's friends had provided, Ryan let himself in. Ranger greeted him enthusiastically, clearly agitated by Foster's absence and the disruption to his routine. "It's okay, boy," Ryan soothed, kneeling to ruffle the dog's fur. "Foster's going to be okay. He just needs some medical attention." Ryan checked Ranger's food and water, then took him outside for a quick bathroom break. As he watched the German Shepherd sniffing around Foster's backyard, Ryan was struck by how comfortable Ranger seemed here. This was his home now. Foster had created a good life for him, with a spacious yard and what looked like plenty of toys and attention. When they went back inside, Ryan noticed the framed photographs on Foster's mantel. Several showed Foster and Ranger together, looking happy. There was one of Ranger wearing what appeared to be a special service dog vest designed to accommodate Foster's needs. Ryan sank onto Foster's couch, suddenly overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. He had come into this believing the solution was simple. Ranger was his dog, wrongfully taken, and should be returned. But now, Having seen Foster's seizure and the life he had built with Ranger came and rested his head on Ryan's knee, looking up with those soulful eyes that seemed to understand everything. Ryan scratched behind his ears, just the way he knew the dog liked. "What are we going to do, buddy?" he whispered. "How do we make this right for everyone?" As he sat there in Foster's living room, surrounded by evidence of another man's bond with his dog, Ryan Mitchell began to form a plan. It wouldn't be easy, and it would require sacrifice from everyone involved, but it might be the only way forward that honored the needs of both veterans and, most importantly, what was best for Ranger himself. When Foster returned from the hospital, they would need to have a serious conversation, veteran to veteran, man to man, and Ryan would have to find the courage to suggest something he never thought he could, a compromise that might break his heart all over again. 3 days after the community center meeting, Ryan sat alone in the darkened living room of what had once been his and Jessica's home. He hadn't bothered to turn on the lights as evening fell, letting the shadows grow longer until they engulfed him completely. On the coffee table before him sat Foster's business card with his cell phone number scrawled on the back, given to Ryan by the hospital nurse when he'd dropped off Ranger at Foster's house after his release. Marion had been to call. Had picked up the phone a dozen times, but what would he say? That he was giving up? That he was walking away from the one connection to his former life that had kept him sane through years of combat and months of rehabilitation? The quiet house echoed with emptiness. Jessica had taken the last of her things while Ryan was at the community center. A note on the kitchen counter informed him that she would be staying with her sister until the divorce was finalized. She had left her key. Ryan's nightmares had returned with a vengeance. Each night he woke gasping, reaching instinctively for Ranger's reassuring presence beside the bed, only to grasp empty air. The memories he had kept at bay for so long came flooding back in the darkness, the ambush in Kandahar, the searing pain of shrapnel tearing through his leg, the metallic smell of blood mixed with dust. Without Ranger to ground him, to wake him from the worst of the terrors, Ryan found himself slipping. He'd begun avoiding sleep, staying up until exhaustion claimed him, only to jerk awake an hour later, heart-pounding, sweat-soaked, and disoriented. Commander Wilson called daily, his concern evident even through Ryan's terse responses. The Veterans Support Group had reached out, too, inviting him to meetings he couldn't bring himself to attend. How could he sit in a circle and talk about moving forward when he felt trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake? The doorbell rang, startling Ryan from his brooding thoughts. He considered ignoring it, but the persistent visitor knocked next, heavy and determined. With a sigh, Ryan hauled himself to his feet and made his way to the door. Officer Thomas Burke stood on the porch, still in uniform, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Mitchell," he said with a nod, "can I come in?" Ryan stepped aside, wordlessly, allowing his old classmate to enter. Burke surveyed the darkened house with a policeman's practiced eye, taking in the empty pizza boxes, the unwashed dishes in the sink, the general air of neglect that had settled over everything in just a few short days. "Got any coffee?" Burke asked, making his way to the kitchen as if he'd been there 100 times before. Ryan flipped on the lights, wincing at the sudden brightness. "Probably. Help yourself." Burke rummaged through cabinets until he found what he needed, setting about making coffee with efficient movements. "Heard you haven't been returning calls." "Been busy," Ryan muttered, knowing how hollow the excuse sounded in the face of his obvious inactivity. Rake snorted, but didn't argue. The coffee maker sputtered to life, filling the kitchen with the rich aroma of brewing coffee. "Foster's asking about you." Ryan's head snapped up. "What?" "Says you never called him after the hospital. Wanted to make sure you were okay." A wave of shame washed over Ryan. Foster, who had every reason to see him as a threat, was concerned about his well-being. Meanwhile, Ryan had been wallowing in self-pity, unable to face the reality of his situation. "I'm fine," Ryan said automatically. Burke poured 2 mugs of coffee, sliding one across the counter to Ryan. "Bullshit. You look like hell, Mitchell. When's the last time you slept? Or showered, for that matter?" Brian ran a hand over his stubbled jaw. "What are you, my mother?" "No, I'm the guy who's going to haul your ass to the VA hospital if you don't pull yourself together," Burke replied evenly. "PTSD's nothing to mess around with, man. I've seen what it does to guys who try to handle it alone." Ryan stared into his coffee, the dark liquid reflecting his haggard face. "I had it under control before. With Ranger—" "Ranger's not here now," Burke said, his voice gentler. "And you need help. Professional help, not just a service dog." The truth of Burke's words stung, but Ryan couldn't deny them. He had been using Ranger as a crutch, depending on the dog to manage symptoms he should have been addressing with therapy and proper treatment. "There's a meeting tomorrow night," Burke continued. "Veteran support group at the community center, 7 o'clock. I'll pick you up at 6:30. It wasn't a request, and Ryan didn't have the energy to argue. He nodded mutely, taking a sip of coffee that had already grown cold. Burke stayed for another hour, making small talk about town gossip and high school memories, safe topics that required little engagement from Ryan. When he finally left, extracting a promise that Ryan would at least shower and eat something substantial before tomorrow's meeting, the house felt slightly less oppressive. Ryan slept fitfully that night, but for the first time since returning home, he forced himself to face the nightmares rather than flee from them. When he woke gasping at 3 a.m., he practiced the grounding techniques his first therapist had taught him, naming 5 things he could see, 4 things he could touch, 3 things he could hear, 2 things he could smell, and 1 thing he could taste. It wasn't the same as having Ranger's warm presence beside him, but it helped. The next day passed in a fog of restless activity. Ryan cleaned the house mechanically, throwing out the accumulated trash and washing dishes that had been sitting for days. He found the divorce papers Jessica had left, signed them without reading the details, and set them aside to mail. What did it matter now? The marriage had been over long before he came home. At precisely 6:30, Burke's cruiser pulled into the driveway. Ryan was ready, showered, and dressed in clean clothes, though the hollow look in his eyes remained. The veterans' meeting was held in a small room at the back of the community center. About 15 men and women of various ages sat in a loose circle, some chatting quietly, others sitting in contemplative silence. Ryan recognized a few faces from around town, but was relieved to see that Foster wasn't among them. A tall, lean man with salt and pepper hair approached as Ryan hesitated in the doorway. "You must be Ryan Mitchell. I'm David Mercer, group facilitator. Thomas mentioned you might join us tonight." Ryan shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the prosthetic limb visible beneath Mercer's rolled-up sleeve. Another veteran who understood loss in a way civilians never could. "Not sure how much help I'll be," Ryan admitted, "or how much help I can get." Mercer smiled slightly. "Just listening is enough for your first time. No pressure to share unless you want to." The meeting followed a simple format. Veterans introduced themselves by name and branch of service, then Mercer opened the floor for discussion. The topic tonight was adjusting to civilian life, the challenges of finding purpose after the structured environment of military service. Ryan listened as men and women shared stories that echoed his own struggles. A Marine who couldn't hold down a job because ordinary workplace stress paled in comparison to combat pressure. An Air Force veteran who slept on the floor because beds felt too soft after years of cots and sleeping bags. A young Army sergeant who described the disconnect she felt trying to explain her experiences to family who could never truly understand. When it came Ryan's turn to speak, he surprised himself by opening up about Ranger. The words poured out, how the dog had saved his life in Afghanistan, how he'd become Ryan's anchor in the stormy seas of PTSD, how losing him felt like losing a part of himself. But the hardest part, Ryan concluded, his voice rough with emotion, is knowing that he's saving someone else now. That Foster needs him just as much as I do, maybe more. And I don't know how to let go of that, of him, when it feels like letting go of the only good thing that came out of all those years of war. The room fell silent when he finished speaking. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of people who didn't know what to say, but the respectful quiet of those who understood exactly what he meant. Finally, an older Vietnam veteran named Carl spoke up. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do isn't charge into battle. It's knowing when to retreat, when to surrender something precious for the greater good. Doesn't make it any less painful, though. Ryan met the older man's eyes, seeing in them the wisdom of someone who had faced his own impossible choices. How do you live with it? The loss? Whole day at a time, Carl replied simply. And you find new purpose, new connections. It's never the same, but eventually it becomes enough. After the meeting, Ryan stood outside in the crisp night air, oddly lighter despite having exposed his raw wounds to a room full of virtual strangers. Burke approached, car keys in hand. Ready to head home? Ryan shook his head. There's somewhere I need to go first. Can you drop me at Foster's place? Burke studied him for a moment before nodding. You sure about this? No, Ryan admitted, but it's time. The drive to Foster's house was silent, Ryan rehearsing words in his mind that seemed inadequate no matter how he arranged them. When they pulled up outside, he saw the lights were on, Foster's silhouette visible through the living room curtains. Want me to wait? Burke asked. Ryan took a deep breath and shook his head. No, I'll walk home. Could use the time to think. As Burke's cruiser pulled away, Ryan stood at the end of Foster's driveway, gathering his courage. He was about to take the hardest step of his life, harder than deploying to a combat zone, harder than facing enemy fire. He was going to let go of Ranger, not because he wanted to, but because sometimes love meant putting someone else's needs above your own. With heavy steps, Ryan walked to Foster's front door and knocked, each tap feeling like another nail in the coffin of the life he had planned. When Foster opened the door, surprise evident on his face, Ryan heard the familiar sound of Ranger's nails clicking on hardwood as he approached from inside the house. "Mitchell," Foster said cautiously, "I didn't expect to see you." "We need to talk," Ryan replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging within. "About Ranger. About the future." Foster nodded slowly, wheeling back to allow Ryan entry into the home that now housed the one thing he loved most in the world, the dog he was about to give up for good. The evening sunlight filtered through Foster's living room windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, where Ranger lay, head on his paws, eyes darting between the two men who sat facing each other in tense silence. Ryan had been there for nearly an hour, the conversation moving in fits and starts as both veterans circled the difficult truth at the heart of their situation. "So you fired Carl," Ryan said, referring to the dog walker who had been mistreating Ranger. Foster nodded, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. "The minute you showed me that video, I had no idea he was being so rough with Ranger." His face darkened. "No excuse for that kind of treatment, especially with a trained service animal." "Ranger's too smart to put up with it for long," Ryan observed, a hint of pride in his voice. "He was probably just confused about why someone associated with you would treat him that way." Foster studied Ryan carefully. "Mitchell, I appreciate you coming by to check on Ranger after my seizure, and for alerting me about Carl, but I get the feeling there's something else on your mind." Ryan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gathering his thoughts. The moment had come, the moment he'd been dreading since he knocked on Foster's door. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." Ryan began slowly. "About Ranger. About what's best for him. And for both of us." Ranger's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and he moved to sit beside Ryan's chair, as if sensing the importance of the conversation. "It's a veterans meeting last night. Something clicked for me," Ryan continued. "We all talked about finding purpose after service, about adjusting to civilian life, and I realized that I've been using Ranger as a crutch. Don't get me wrong, he's been essential to my recovery, but I've been depending on him exclusively instead of developing other coping mechanisms." Foster remained silent, allowing Ryan to work through his thoughts. "When I saw you have that seizure at the town meeting, it hit me how much you need him too, not just for mobility assistance, but for your actual survival." Ryan's voice grew rough with emotion. "Ranger is trained to alert to your seizures. Without him, you're at risk every day." Foster's expression softened slightly. "I won't deny that, but that doesn't invalidate your connection with him, or what he means to you." "No, it doesn't," Ryan agreed. "But it does change how I have to think about this situation." He took a deep breath. "I came here tonight to tell you that I'm withdrawing any claim to Ranger. He's your dog now, legally and morally. I won't fight you for him anymore." The words hung in the air between them, weighty and final. Ranger seemed to sense the shift, looking between the two men with those intelligent eyes that had seen the worst of humanity in war zones and the best of it in those who serve. Foster sat back in his wheelchair, clearly surprised by Ryan's declaration. "That's not what I expected you to say." "It's not what I expected to say either," Ryan admitted with a sad smile. "But it's the right thing to do." "Because of my medical condition?" "Partly," Ryan nodded, "but also because I can see that you've given him a good home. You need each other. And I need to find my way forward without using him as my only lifeline." Foster was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the arm of his wheelchair. Finally he spoke. "You know, when I first heard about your situation, a returning soldier whose wife sold his service dog, I felt terrible. If I had known the circumstances, I might never have bought Ranger in the first place." "You bought him legally," Ryan said. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Maybe not legally," Foster conceded. "But morally, I'm not so sure anymore." He wheeled himself closer to where Ranger sat between them. "I've been thinking too, Mitchell, about what it would mean to keep a dog that means so much to another veteran, especially one who served with him overseas." Ryan's heart constricted painfully. Was Foster about to return Ranger after all? The hope that flared within him was quickly doused by his own resolve. He had made his decision, the right decision, and he wouldn't go back on it now, no matter how much it hurt. "It's done, Foster," Ryan said firmly. "Ranger stays with you. I just wanted you to know face to face that I'm stepping back." Foster studied him thoughtfully. "What if there was another option? One that neither of us has considered yet?" Ryan frowned, uncertain where this was heading. "What do you mean?" "I've got a meeting planned. I'm going to do some research since the seizure, at the town meeting," Foster explained. "There's a program in Portland that specifically trains seizure alert dogs for veterans with TBI, epilepsy. They have a dog there now, a female German Shepherd named Sierra, who's completing her training and needs placement." Ryan's confusion must have shown on his face, because Foster continued, his words coming faster now. "What I'm trying to say is, what if Ranger could split his time between us? He could live primarily with me, given my medical needs, but spend regular time with you, weekends maybe, or a few days each week. And meanwhile, I could apply for Sierra through the program. If I qualify, eventually I could transition to having her as my full-time service dog, and Ranger could return to you permanently." The proposal hung in the air between them, unexpected and complex. Ryan hadn't considered a shared arrangement, had been prepared to walk away completely for Foster's sake. "You'd do that?" Ryan asked finally. "You'd be willing to share him after all this?" Foster's expression was solemn. "Mitchell, we're both served. We both know what it means to sacrifice for others. I can't in good conscience keep Ranger exclusively, knowing what he means to you, what you've been through together. And frankly," he glanced down at Ranger, who was watching them intently, "I think he misses you. He gets excited whenever I mention your name." As if to confirm this, Ranger's tail thumped against the floor at the sound of Ryan's name. "Besides," Foster continued with a wry smile, "the seizures aren't my only medical issue. Getting around with these," he gestured to his missing legs, "is challenging enough without adding epilepsy to the mix. Having 2 trained service dogs working together as a team, Sierra for seizure alerts and Ranger for mobility assistance, might be the ideal solution for me in the long run." Ryan felt something shift within him, the tight knot of grief and loss loosening just slightly. It wasn't everything he had hoped for when he first discovered Ranger was gone, but it was more than he had dared to hope for just moments ago. "How would this work?" he asked cautiously. "Practically speaking." "We'd need to work out a schedule," Foster replied. "Consistent days, so Ranger knows what to expect. We'd both need to use the same commands, the same routines as much as possible. It would take communication, compromise. And if the Portland program doesn't accept you, or if Sierra doesn't work out—" Foster didn't hesitate. "Then we keep sharing Ranger, for as long as necessary." Ryan looked down at Ranger, who had moved to press his muzzle against Ryan's hand, that familiar gesture of comfort and connection that had sustained him through the darkest of times. The thought of having even part of that back in his life sent a surge of emotion through him so powerful he had to take a deep breath to steady himself. "I never expected this," Ryan admitted. "When I came here tonight, I thought I was saying goodbye for good. Sometimes the hardest roads lead to unexpected destinations," Foster said quietly. "I think we both know something about that." Ryan extended his hand across the space between them. "Thank you for being willing to consider this." Foster took his hand in a firm grip. "Thank you for your service, Mitchell, both overseas and here. What you were willing to do tonight, sacrifice your own needs for mine, that's the kind of honor they don't give medals for." As they shook hands, Ranger let out a small whine, looking between them with what almost seemed like relief. Whatever the path forward held, it would be complicated and require adjustment from all of them. But for the first time since returning home to find Ranger gone, Ryan felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. The Veterans Day ceremony in Oak Ridge was always a solemn affair, marked by the small-town sincerity that characterized all their gatherings. American flags lined Main Street, their edges fluttering in the crisp November breeze. Nearly everyone in town had turned out, standing shoulder to shoulder in the town square, as Mayor Thompson delivered his annual address from the gazebo that had been decorated with red, white, and blue bunting for the occasion. Ryan stood at the edge of the crowd, Ranger sitting attentively at his side. It had been 7 months since that evening in Foster's living room when they had forged their unexpected arrangement. 7 months of adjustments, compromises, and a gradually evolving understanding that had surprised them both with its depth and meaning. "Mitchell, over here!" Michael Foster waved from his position near the front, where a section had been reserved for veterans. His wheelchair gleamed in the autumn sunlight, recently polished for the occasion. Beside him sat a sleek German shepherd with intelligent eyes. Sierra, his new seizure alert dog, who had completed her training and been placed with Foster just 6 weeks earlier. Ryan made his way through the crowd, people parting respectfully to let him and Ranger through. Many nodded in recognition, some reaching out to shake his hand or pat him on the shoulder. The town had watched the drama of Ranger's ownership unfold and then transform into something none of them had expected: a partnership between 2 veterans that had ultimately benefited the entire community. "Thought you might not make it," Foster said as Ryan took the empty seat beside him. "Heard the morning handoff was a bit rough." Ryan grimaced slightly. Ranger didn't want to leave Jessica's place. She made bacon for breakfast. The mention of Jessica no longer carried the sting it once had. After the divorce was finalized, they had begun the slow process of rebuilding a friendship from the ashes of their marriage. She had been the one to suggest that Ranger might stay with her on the nights when Ryan worked late shifts at the Veterans Center, creating yet another link in the unusual chain of care that now surrounded the German Shepherd. "Can't blame him for that," Foster chuckled. "How's the new program coming along?" Ryan smiled, the pride evident in his expression. "We've got 3 more dogs in training now, 2 German Shepherds and a Belgian Malinois. Dr. Anderson's been a godsend with the veterinary care." The Veterans Service Dog Training Program had been Ryan's brainchild, born from his experiences with Ranger and Foster. With seed funding from a VA grant and Foster's connections in the business community, they had transformed the back section of the Oak Ridge Animal Shelter into a training facility where veterans could learn to work with service dogs specifically matched to their needs. Mayor Thompson's voice rose over the murmur of the crowd. "And now I'd like to call forward 2 of Oak Ridge's finest, Ryan Mitchell and Michael Foster, to say a few words about the program that has brought national attention to our little town." A round of applause rippled through the gathering as Ryan and Foster moved toward the gazebo, their dogs walking perfectly in step beside them. Ryan had never been comfortable with public speaking, but as he looked out at the familiar faces of his hometown, he found the words coming naturally. "A year ago, I came home from a final deployment to discover that my service dog, Ranger, had been sold while I was overseas," Ryan began, his voice steady. "I was angry, heartbroken, and determined to get him back at any cost." Ranger sat at attention between Ryan and Foster's wheelchair, his ears perked forward as if following every word. "What I didn't realize then was that losing Ranger would set me on a path to something bigger than myself. When I discovered that Michael, a fellow veteran with medical needs even more critical than my own, had legally purchased Ranger, I faced a choice: fight for what I wanted or recognize what was truly needed." Foster took over seamlessly, his deep voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "What happened next wasn't just about 2 men finding a compromise over a dog. It was about a community coming together to support its veterans. It was about recognizing that the bonds we forge in service don't end when we come home. They evolve, they expand, and sometimes they save us in ways we never expected." Ryan nodded in agreement. The Veteran Service Dog Training Program grew from our situation. We realized that there were many veterans in need of service animals and many dogs in need of purpose. By bringing them together with the support of this community, we've created something that helps heal wounds both visible and invisible. As they concluded their brief remarks, the applause was thunderous. Ryan caught sight of Jessica in the crowd, standing next to Officer Burke. They had been dating for a few months now, a development that had initially surprised Ryan but now seemed right somehow. Burke had been there for her during the darkest days of their separation, and unlike Ryan, he could offer her the stable, present partnership she had always craved. Commander Wilson approached as they left the podium, his hand extended in congratulation. "Proud of you, boys," he said gruffly. "This is what service is all about. Finding ways to continue the mission even after you hang up the uniform." The ceremony concluded with the playing of taps, the mournful notes hanging in the air as the town observed a moment of silence for those who hadn't made it home. Ryan stood at attention, Ranger a warm presence against his leg, and reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. There had been difficult days, especially at first. The schedule of sharing Ranger had required adjustment from everyone involved. There were times when Ryan desperately needed Ranger's comfort, but it wasn't his day. There were nights when the nightmares returned, and he had to rely on the coping mechanisms he'd learned in therapy rather than the immediate solace of Ranger's presence. But there had been unexpected gifts, too. The friendship that had developed between Ryan and Foster transcended their initial conflict, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared experience that few civilians could understand. The community had rallied around their program, donating space, supplies, and time to help it succeed. And perhaps most surprisingly, Ryan had discovered a talent for dog training that gave him a new sense of purpose and direction. After the ceremony, a small reception was held at the community center. Ryan found himself surrounded by well-wishers and curious visitors from neighboring towns who had heard about the program and wanted to learn more. As he answered questions and shared stories, he noticed Foster across the room, deep in conversation with a young veteran in a wheelchair, Sierra alert at his side. "Quite a change from last year," Dr. Anderson commented, appearing at Ryan's elbow with a cup of punch. "Remember how divided the town was? Now look at everyone." Ryan followed her gaze, taking in the scene. Veterans and civilians mingled freely. Several service dogs in training moved among the crowd with their handlers, and there was a palpable sense of purpose and community in the air. "I never would have chosen this path," Ryan admitted. "If someone had told me on the day I came home that losing Ranger would lead to all this, I wouldn't have believed them. Sometimes our greatest losses open doors we never knew existed," Dr. Anderson said softly. "And sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a new beginning." Later that evening, as the gathering wound down, Ryan found himself standing outside the community center with Foster. Sierra was already loaded in Foster's specially equipped van, ready for the drive home. "Your turn with Ranger starts tomorrow," Foster reminded him, preparing to hand over the leash that represented so much more than just control of a dog. "I've got that medical appointment in Billings, so he's all yours for the next 3 days." Ryan nodded, feeling the familiar anticipation that always preceded his time with Ranger. "We'll be fine. Thought I might take him up to Thompson Creek for some hiking. He always loved the water there." "He'd like that," Foster agreed. He hesitated, then added, "You know, the doctors are optimistic about this new medication. If it controls the seizures as well as they think it will, Sierra might be enough support on her own eventually." The implication hung in the air between them, that someday, perhaps sooner than either had expected, Ranger might return to Ryan permanently. It was a possibility that would have once filled Ryan with unalloyed joy, but now carried a bittersweet edge. Their unusual arrangement had created bonds that transcended ownership, connections that had healed wounds far deeper than either man had realized they carried. "A day at a time," Ryan said, echoing the wisdom he'd learned in the veterans group. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." Foster nodded, understanding all that remained unspoken between them. "That's what brothers do." As Ranger looked up at both men, his loyalty divided, yet somehow multiplied by the unlikely path they had traveled together, Ryan Mitchell knew with absolute certainty that he had found something far more valuable than what he had lost. Not just a dog shared between two wounded warriors, but a community, a purpose, and a future bright with possibilities none of them could have imagined a year ago. As we age, we understand that life rarely follows the path we planned. Ryan and Michael's story reminds us that our deepest wounds can become our greatest purpose. These two veterans, one returning to emptiness, the other living with daily challenges, found healing not in winning a battle against each other, but in forming an unexpected alliance. Their journey speaks to those of us who faced loss, a spouse who left, health that betrayed us, or dreams that slipped away. We recognize the courage it takes to open our clenched fists and release what we thought we needed to hold. Like Ryan, many of us have stood at that crossroads where pride demands one path and wisdom another. The beauty of their story isn't just that Ryan recovered something precious. It's that both men discovered something more valuable than ownership, community, purpose and the profound understanding that comes when we transform personal pain into service to others. This story reminds us that even in our golden years, we can find new beginnings, that the wisdom of our generation isn't just in what we've endured, but in how we've learned to share our burdens, and in doing so, lighten them for everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.